Good evening. Thank you, Christophe, and the team at MAK for the warm welcome and the great reception over the past few days. I'm very honored to be joined by a panel of distinguished artists, collectors tonight to discuss some of the issues related to the exhibition, but also related to working inside and outside of the specific context in China. To save time, I'm going to give a very brief introduction of each of the panelists on the stage with me tonight, although I am sure that they require no introduction at all. So on my left-hand side is Jing Yan. Jing Yan is an artist based in Vienna, Taipei, and Hiroshima. Uli Sigg, distinguished collector, especially a collector of Chinese contemporary art. Miao Ying, artist based in Shanghai, also frequently working in New York. Weiwei, of course, a distinguished artist based in Berlin at the moment. Without further ado, I would like to immediately open the discussion, and we are gonna, tonight's format is gonna be a free conversation between all of us. I'm gonna pose some questions, but at the end of the discussion, we would also welcome you to ask questions to the artist and the collector here. So to begin with, although each of the panelists I have given a bit of introduction, I would also like to start by asking each of you a question related to both of your work, specific work in the exhibition, and to your practice in general. Maybe I could start with the local here. Jing Yan, by way of self-introduction, can I ask you to give us a bit more background information to your own upbringing, your experience of being a Chinese, growing up in Australia, in Vienna especially, and working initially in the European context. How does this experience inform your practice? Your work in the exhibition, Paris Syndrome, speaks about a form of displacement and disillusion. Is it a central idea to your work?
Good evening, good Abend. I'll try to keep myself short because I think most of the people are not here to listen to my talk. No.
It shouldn't be like that.
Yes, no, modesty. I'm curious to hear myself. No, I grew up, I was born in China, in mainland China, in a city called Qintian. And my parents moved to Austria in 1979. And basically, I moved to Austria in 1979. So I'm completely Viennese. It's maybe important to say the city we're from makes up almost 90% of all the Chinese in Italy, in Switzerland, or in Austria, in Spain, and all these places. So just to finish off one thing, so I'm educated, of course, in Vienna, within the Vienna context of the 1980s, which is very different to the Vienna context of today. But of course, for the last 10 years, I've been also living in Taiwan and also in Yokohama, Japan. So I'll leave it up to now, and then we can maybe discuss other things.
I also asked you if you could address a little bit about the work that you are showing in the exhibition and how is that related to your upbringing that you were just describing to us.
Well, maybe the work was shot in 2007 while I was doing a research in south of China in the province Guangdong, Guangzhou area. And it deals mainly with real estate areas. So for the last 15 years, China has been, experienced a huge boom. People moving to the city, you could say different new classes of middle class, upper class. And at the same time, there are these massive buildings, constructions. And these buildings, they resemble sort of European areas, like Little Venice or Little France in all these areas. So I was interested in what these areas kind of mean. I wasn't there to judge, to say this is, oh, why do they copy or not copy? It wasn't a question on this, but I was interested in how far these images, these built places, represent a certain desire. But a desire we all have. It might not be, you know, the French thing that I have desired, but I might want to live in a case study house or anything else. This sort of desire, and I was interested in this sort of desire. And that's why it's called Paris Syndrome, which deals with an idea of Paris as a desirable place within psychology. But one scene in the film, which is interesting, is depicting the Vienna Secession building. It's built in China, of course, even bigger. And it functions as a side building entrance to one of these huge real estate areas. So, of course, coming from Vienna, it's something I had to film.
That's great. Moving on to Miao Ying, you are among the youngest generation of artists in the exhibition. Also the youngest of the panelists tonight. You grew up in Shanghai, initially educated in National Art Academy in Hangzhou, and then in the States for your MA. This is, in a way, a common experience shared by many young Chinese artists of your generation. I would like to ask you how your educations and cultural exposures in China and overseas affect your choice of focus in your work and your way of working. And in relation to that, maybe you can talk to us a bit about the work specifically that you are showing in the exhibition here.
So I felt I was really lucky because I graduated from the program New Media Arts, which I believe was the first fine art program about new media art in China. And I was also very lucky because the program was directed by artist Zentrum Paul Klee, whose work is also included in the show. And he is one of the video pioneer of Chinese contemporary art, and he also invited a lot of the pioneers, artists to come and to teach us when we were in college. Then shortly after I was graduated, I went to the States and I studied again in new media art for my MFA. So my work has always, because my generation, in China we call it the post-80s generation. And we were the really, the first generation that grew up, first of all, we're all only child, so we don't have any siblings. And we're also the first generation to grow up under the open policy, or some people call it the reform of economy. So I think we really grew up in the digital, with the digital. I remember my first personal computer. And also, that's why I think my work has always been concentrated more in the realm of internet. And especially, I think the first work, my first internet work was in 2007. I spent 3 months and 10 hours each day and searching each terms from a standard Chinese dictionary to Google, and to find out what are the words that were censored from google.cn, which I think a lot of has happened for the past decades, because now we don't have Google anymore. And on the other hand, I think it's also very interesting because now we have all those local internet tycoons, and it's actually not that local, it's quite international. We have Alibaba, we have WeChat, Tencent, and all those big unicorn companies. So my work has, my work is like interested in discussing, in relationship of those internet realms and technology, and how that, of course, changed the life of the Chinese. And the work that I'm showing in the exhibition space is called the Chinese name, but in French, which I cannot pronounce. It's actually inspired by how much Chinese really are into buying those luxury branding, and we would love to buy the brand that we cannot pronounce. And I think it's quite common in Europe that people say it all the time. And this French this Chinese dream in French is a fake branding, and it's inspired by the Chinese dream. And I found it in common how the ideology and sometimes with luxury branding, they all have this, it's quite abstract and it doesn't really tell you much in the details. It's almost like a really fancy perfume. So when you first walk in, you see this really sleek window design, thing, and then, but what's inside is quite empty, which, is quite abstract. But then maybe when you walk to the back, you see more, and then you realize that there's actually a mattress on it. So maybe the best way to receive a dream is to take a nap first, and also how it's in comparison with, American dream. So that's the installation that we see at the space.
Great. Weiwei, 艾老师. I'm currently writing an essay about your practice for an upcoming museum exhibition of yours in the States. And one of the biggest challenges to this task, actually two, are on one hand, there is the incredible breadth of your work and practice. It's very hard for a writer to grasp. On the other hand, there is the fact that you have moved away from China since 2015. Your current absence in the Chinese art world has made it harder to have access to your thinking and your work. Could you talk about your recent practice and how it relates to your earlier practice before you left China? In this show, most of the works were made in the former period before you left China.
Well, it sounds I had some exposure of my art before I moved out, which is not exactly true. China is a society. I've been started my art since 1979, one among the first generations. But then I left China in '81, spent 12 years in New York, then went back. 1993. From 1993 to 2015, I almost had no exhibitions in China. And right after my detention, I made an exhibition just like a few days before my departure for Germany. Because the authorities said, you're free now. After 4 or 5 years of soft detention, they said you're free. So I said, what do you mean I'm free? Can I have an exhibition? So I challenged them, right? I mean, what do you mean when you talk about the artist, he's free? So they accepted the challenge. They, of course, after many discussions, they said, yes, you can have one exhibition. So luckily, there's two galleries have courage. So they both want me to have an exhibition. So I decided to show one work in 2 galleries. So since these 2 galleries are connected, one, there's neighbors, one next to another, so I would do half work in each of the gallery. That means the work have to go through the wall, and when your audience come to each gallery, you only can see half. You have to go to another gallery to see other half. To still meet the statement, I never had a work showing in a Chinese gallery, because you only can see half in one gallery and another half in a foreign gallery, which is an Italian gallery. And yeah, it's, I enjoy this kind of conversation. So basically, my art have no influence in China. Even I was among the earliest people fighting for artistic freedom. I made almost like first art space in China called China Art Archives and Warehouse. I made 3 underground books, but still, my name, if you type my name in Chinese internet, still will be deleted. So I can tell you, I do not have influence in China. And suddenly I become, when I come out, I realize I become really quite popular, for wrong reason maybe. But yeah, I've been out for 3 years now. Most time I spend in my Berlin studio, which is a basement. It's an old beer cellar, built like 150 years ago. And immediately I got involved with refugee situation, because what can I do? When you come to Berlin, Germany have accept 1.2 million refugees. So I'm very curious, who are they and how they get to Europe? So I went to Lesbos, and I meet the first refugee in my life when they come down out of this kind of dinghy boat, very, very horrifying situation. You see people from Turkey, and in middle of night with children, women, just trying to find a location they can escape, and they give up everything. So since then, I decided to make a film. I made a film called Human Flow. It's about refugee situation. And that's what I really do care about, because I share the same feeling. When I was born, my father was exiled. So I grew up in a location I can never call it home. I spent about 20 years with my family in very remote area, which we call Xinjiang. It's a location till today, China still put Weiwei people in detention center, re-educate them, 100,000 of them, in very horrible situation. So I don't want to keep talking because it will be too long. So yeah, trying to answer your question.
It's great. I actually found your last exhibition before you left China very melancholy and very touching in many, many ways. It was a very meaningful exhibition, especially to me personally. I would like to move the question to Uli now. Uli, I remember you have once described your role in the Chinese art world as a researcher in your approach to art collecting. I sat in a couple of meetings you had with artists and witnessed how you ask questions to the artists about the process and thinking behind their works. You are truly fascinated by both the works and the people who make them. In many cases, you have formed strong friendship with the artists. Could you talk about your approach to collecting? What are the motivations and challenges? This exhibition that we see here is only a small fraction of your collection of artworks, but it does reflect your years of working and your years of thinking behind collecting. So it would be great if you can talk a little bit about that.
I admit it's not easy to think of me as not a collector, since I put together some 2,500 artworks, but I consider myself a researcher. And I was just lucky to acquire some fruits of my research in the end. I also never thought of myself as a collector for very long. And I probably wouldn't be a collector by nature, but I came into this Chinese situation at a historic moment. I was very lucky, not my merit to be there at the right time. And I could see Chinese contemporary art develop from day one. And I could also see that no one was collecting Chinese contemporary art in even a remotely systematic way. And so when I realized that, being very surprised that in the biggest cultural space of the world, no one cared what artists were doing, assumed a self-imposed mission of collecting like a national institution should, but did not. But I did it with the intent to give it to China. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, I didn't know to whom. So I assembled it never with the idea that this is mine. That maybe is another distinction to a normal collector. So that's how I put together this collection, trying to mirror the art creation of China across all media, along the timeline. And since I started my approach because my ultimate study object is China, I researched it through business, establishing this early business, which was a difficult lesson, through diplomacy, politics, and a third approach through art, contemporary art. So I didn't necessarily think of collecting in a traditional way, but I needed access through the artists. First of all, there were no galleries when I started. There was no other way. Second, I was not interested in buying a finished product from a gallery. Nothing against that, but that was not my intent. So the discourse with the artist was always very important to me to come closer to my ultimate study object. That was a long explanation.
You are a very lucky researcher. Thank you all for the sharing. I would now like to move the discussion to a second aspect of my thinking for the panel tonight is about living and working elsewhere. And I think this is something that some of you have touched upon in your previous responses to my question. And also I would like to ask you about the relationship of contemporary art to the Chinese society. Since in all of your work there is a certain tension with the existing structure of power, identity, and value, as it is a subject that you all scrutinize very closely and question constantly in your practice. In the case of Ai Weiwei, the antagonism with the authority is so much that you actually have to leave the country. This kind of criticality and tension in your work is very much related to the friction between the critical spirit embedded in contemporary art and the zero tolerance for independent thinking and value in the Chinese political system. In the meantime, such a profoundly problematic reality inspires and shapes so much of your work. So I would like to ask you how you maintain that sense of tension and problematic when you actually work elsewhere. Is it possible at all? Maybe we can start with Ai Weiwei.
Well, I used to say I was not becoming radical. I was born radical. My father was a poet. He studied in Paris in 1930s, and he studied art. But right after he moved back to China, he has been put in jail by Kuomintang that time, sentenced for 6 years. You know, a 20 years old boy, just come back from Paris, sentenced for 6 years. I always try to imagine, how that can be possible. Then later, he joined the revolution in Jing Yan, the first generation of literature men, and they established the new nation with the early so-called revolutionaries. Then immediately, 8 years, 1957, 8 years later, he has been criticized as a rightist. During that moment, nearly 500,000 of the Chinese intellectuals being purged and being sent into education camps. So 1957 was the year I was born. So my whole life is about under this kind of heavy political pressure, not directly to me. At the beginning was to my family, my father. And I don't even understand it because for me it's it's nature condition, it's very natural. So, but when I grow up, and when I spent about 12 years in the United States trying to become an artist, of course I was a failure. I understand I can never really establish myself in New York. Even I dreamed as many art students, and ended up I drawing portraits on 42nd Street for people. $10 a portraits, plus a paper frame would add another $5, which I don't pay tax. It's cash. It really support me for many years. So then everything was fine. Of course, I don't like China that much. Even my father is the most patriotic poet, but I have no reason to like China because it does never offer us any kind of sense of security or someone you can trust or some value you really respect. So I'm very different from my father. He, till his death, he still loved China. And I never have that kind of sensitivity. And till I get on internet, I thought, this is wonderful. This is something really, it's like a dream. So I can start writing my opinions. So I become crazy, Before I never learned how to type, but I would work on the internet day and night. It's like a madman. Every day I would write 3 articles. I got a massive people following because they say, who is this guy? Why he's so liberally talking about anything in his mind. That time, China, the government is still not prepared how to control the internet. And that's a period between 2005 to 2009 till they finally shut off all my blogs, 3 blogs in different commercial, so-called commercial, independent business. But they shut it off in the same second. So today, if you think about, they think Huawei is independent business, which is a lie. There's no independent business in China. Everything controlled by Communist Party. By law, they have to give out the secret. They have a responsibility. As a Chinese so-called citizen, there's no Chinese citizen. It's just someone who holds Chinese passport. And have to give all the secret to the state. This is, nobody, there's no exception. So I become crazy, I become a very radical because you need a vehicle to become radical. So internet is my vehicle and it is fantastic, but till I got arrested and, did I really follow you? What do you want to ask me? It's getting too long.
No, I think you answered it briefly, beautifully. I was asking you how you managed to uphold that sense of tension.
Yeah. I never tried to manage anything. I always say I'm just like a leaf floating in the river. I'm never against anything. I never really try to manage it. I have no purpose, no targets in my life. There's no clear ideology. I try to keep flow. And that sometimes, as a surprise, put me on this stage. But tomorrow morning, I'll fly back to Berlin. That's clear.
Thank you. Miao Ying, I want to ask you, your work deals very specifically with internet censorship in China, and you once compared one's relationship to the censorship mechanism on the Chinese internet as someone developing a Stockholm syndrome, identifying with the kidnapper. I would like to ask you if you yourself have developed somehow a syndrome of a kind by describing and trying to portray how the Chinese internet work in your own practice.
I remember what Weiwei 老师 just said. I remember his blog actually, and there was a timing. I think it was 2006 and 2007. It was like when blogging was starting to exist in China. But then, like, although they blocked blogger.com, like the biggest blogging website right away, but there's a lot of local service that people can still do blog, and blog was big in China. And I think you were saying was 2005 to 2009. And I personally think 2009, 2010, like what Weiwei just said, it's a really turning timing, at least in the internet, because before 2010, there was a time that, you know, when Google and YouTube and Twitter was all existing in China for a while. But then I think 2010, because iPhone was really getting popular, and then because of the fake iPhones that's produced in Shenzhen, and every Chinese, for the first time, they really have access to the internet. And before that, you know, it's more like a personal computer, and it was still more expensive. I think for those people who live in the countryside, they have to go to those internet cafe. And inside of internet cafe, there's not much privacy, really. People usually just playing games. But I think, because 2007, because iPhone, and then the fake iPhone got really popular in China because it's so cheap. And then I think all the Chinese starting to have the access to social media. And that's when everything's starting to shut down in China. Google left, and then, you know, YouTube, everything was blocked. And that, I think at that timing, for me, because that's when, so I went back to China right away when I got the degree in the States. And so when I moved back to China, it was 2009, and I starting to realize that, because that's when the time they just shut down the Twitter, and everybody was using Xinglang, Weibo. And I was kind of angry at first. I was like, oh, why you guys are using Xinglang? The only reason why it's popular is because that, you know, Twitter is not available anymore. But then like soon I realized it's actually fascinating, because it's really rich, and for the first time that I starting to realize, you know, it's what's more interesting than censorship is maybe self-censorship, because that's when you can see how the netizens really respond to censorship. It's really creative, and they can create something, you know, that sounds like the word that's being censored, but, you know, it can even be an image, because image cannot be censored online. So I think my work, on one hand, starting to concentrate more on the self-censorship, because I really think it's the creativity of the Chinese internet. And also I think Chinese are really quick learners on technologies. Like, you know, if you go to China now, everybody is using digital pay, WeChat Pay, and also there's everyone's using the barcode and scanning for, you know, bicycles and everything. So, and also to me, I think personally, because my first work was 2007, and I was even kind of complaining about Google, and now I feel like I'm kind of whining about it, because now there's no Google in China. And because I came back to China and live inside of it, and I starting to realize that I kind of starting to miss the time, you know, before Google left China, because although there's censorship, but I feel like, you know, at least we can still get access to that. But I think really starting from 2010, that's when Baidu, because when Google left China, that's when Baidu became the biggest search engine in China. And that's when I starting to, I feel like my personal feelings to it is more like, you know, when you got kidnapped from someone, and then at first they maybe beat you every day, but then like for, you know, a month, and then all of a sudden they only beat you 50 times, or they gave you a cake, and then you kind of fall in love with him. And I starting to have this feeling of, you know, developing this Stockholm syndrome by living inside of the environment. So that's how it got it got developed over the time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Jing Yan, working in Asia, a context that is culturally more intimate to you is for you also a way of working elsewhere. You're working in Asia, but you're actually working away from the European context where you were more familiar with and you were educated in. I know that you have spent considerable amount of time working in Taiwan while your parents live in Qingtian in South China. And Taiwan has a very different cultural dynamic from mainland China. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your way of working, how living in Taiwan specifically has influenced or not influenced your work.
Maybe I had the luxury to grow up in Austria. So it means I take it for granted that when I make a work, a certain amount of it is critical. But I don't do any work on per se to be critical. I think it's a job that we need to be anyway. But so it's a different awareness, of course, of me making a work. And the political aspects, the critical aspects, or even these aspects being arrested or being watched or being surveillanced is an aspect that I'm not familiar with, to be honest. And I think most people in this room are not familiar with. So this is the luxurious background to a certain amount. But when in 2007 and 2008, when I decided to move back to Asia, there were some family reasons because of Japan, but I decided to move to Taiwan. I could not imagine myself living or moving to China. I didn't want to put myself into that context. I didn't want to put myself neither in a political, nor in a cultural, nor in a human context in there, because it wasn't me. It wasn't what I knew, what I grew up, or what I was maybe even capable with. So again, it's also a huge luxury to be able to be in Taiwan. Taiwan is a democracy. It has a female president. There is a very strong political climate, demonstration, self-empowerment, and so on. And I'm very much interested in these aspects. Just to note, in 2009, while being in Taiwan, I initiated and co-founded a non-profit art space, Taipei Contemporary Art Center, which would not be possible in many other places. So through the space and through these things, I engage and take up a position.
Thanks for that. Uli, for you, working elsewhere in a way defines the presentation of contemporary in China, especially after 1989. The collection of yours, as you were describing to us earlier when you were assembling the collection, developing the collection, you have it in mind that it is something that you are going to give back to China eventually. But so far, the collection of yours has been shown in many different places other than mainland China. Can you talk about the experience of showing Chinese contemporary art elsewhere in a context that doesn't necessarily have the cultural references that have supported and informed the works that you are showing?
I don't know where to start because this answer, would be different at any moment in time. And one constant is how much does an audience know about China? If we look at the 80s, 90s, there was outside China almost no information available to a broader public. I remember when I was ambassador, all newspapers had withdrawn their posts after '89 from Beijing, and like a European country like Italy wouldn't have a single person reporting about China. Today, every day we open the newspapers, we will find one page or more about China. So that, of course, very much changed the perception of China for any public outside China. So the first exhibition out of, I think this is the 21st exhibition here about my collection. The first was in Bern. Actually, Weiwei was a co-curator there. And this was the biggest exhibition of Chinese art to that date ever, anywhere. And the reaction was very interesting from my perspective. The people said, and it was, I forgot it, but it was the largest audience the museum had drawn to that time for a contemporary exhibition. And the people said, wow, we are so overwhelmed, we had no idea there is such a width and depth in Chinese art production. The people were not aware the Chinese artists were working with old media, from new media, installation, photo, painting, what have you. So it was a kind of a shock with the public. They just did not expect. Then, of course, the situation and the perception of Chinese art started to change gradually. Also, the art production, of course, started to change. 80s, even part of the 90s, the art, contemporary art from China was distinctly different, actually, from what we would call the global mainstream contemporary art. But then ever more, this distinctive Chinese art start to melt with what we would call this global mainstream. And much of the art for an audience in the West start to look more alike what they are used to, even though it isn't. I would still maintain, and you may see this in this exhibition, the Chinese art is very much not what it appears to be, and it needs a context knowledge, at least a large part of it. And so the art changed, the knowledge within an audience changed, and the needs for making an interesting exhibition changed. And well, we are here today, and it will be your judgment what you think how today's Chinese contemporary art exhibition can be consumed, appreciated, learned about, or discarded.
We will find out later. Now I want to bring us back to the idea of working in the local context as a participant. As much of all of your work involves instituting, creating a certain institutional framework besides your practice as an artist or as a collector. Ai Weiwei, for instance, you have mentioned that your contribution to introducing and supporting conceptual and performance art practices in the mid-1990s in Beijing and China by way of publishing and directing the China Art Archive and Warehouse. For example, Uli Sigg, the CCAA Awards for Contemporary Art Practice and Art Critical Writing that you have set up to support young, emerging, distinguished artist practice, as well as the practice of writing. Jing Yan established the Contemporary Art Center in Taipei around 2009. These efforts are about dissecting and the existing value system and ecology and introducing diverse markers of values into the local art system. Could I invite each of you to talk about this? What was the urgency and the needs behind such initiatives, and what are the impact? Maybe Uli, we can start with your award.
This award, I started some 20 years ago, at that time, there was nothing like an art award for contemporary art in China. There was very limited knowledge about Chinese contemporary art because it couldn't be shown really except for very short instances in kind of underground or semi-underground situations, the majority of it. So I was thinking of how could I create a stage where in China there could be more awareness for contemporary art and more of a discourse. And I had seen so many very good artists, but the West, that's difficult to imagine today, but then had no idea about Chinese contemporary art. So I thought if I create an award and I would invite the gatekeepers to these important venues in the West, that they in the jury would see Chinese contemporary art, and some of them are here. I see Ruth Noack here, who then invited a number of artists to the documenta, which otherwise she would not have known about. So that proved to be very successful, that more and more artists became part of the international art world. And then later, I also, for quite a while, had identified this problem of art critique, of which you are an important part in China today. And I saw that there was almost no independent art critique at the time. This had many reasons, because censorship mainly, so also the fora were not there to express themselves, and there was no money in it to make a living really as an independent art critic. And then the auction catalogs came, and they were actually shaping the taste of the Chinese public, because they were the only information available. And I felt, this should not be a situation for contemporary art where the market dominates what's meaningful and less meaningful art. And so I created the Art Critic Award, where independent art criticism would be chosen. Like, it wouldn't be for a written piece, it would be for for a disposition of a piece to be written. So we could choose a piece that otherwise probably would not have been written, would not have been financed by the market. And so in this way, over 20 years, quite a library of works about Chinese artists for every winner, for art critique, etc., came about. And just this year, after 20 years, I was trying to find a future for this art award. I can't do this to infinity, and need to find someone. The M+ Museum wanted to take it over. So they will continue, and they want to shape it like the Turner Prize, like the jury would select 6 artists for an exhibition, and then choose out of the exhibition a winner. And unfortunately, it's called the Sigg Prize. Personally, I could have called it the Sigg Prize myself, but I felt Chinese Contemporary Art Award is the thing, because it was not about me. I wanted to create it and give it to the Chinese people to continue. It shouldn't be, an exotic foreigner deciding what's meaningful art or less meaningful art in China. Of course, it was never like that, but some people perceived it. It was a jury doing this. So, now it carries this name because M+ insisted on this. And that's the future of it.
We look forward to it. Jing Yan, can you talk about the Contemporary Art Center you have set up in Taiwan? It was a collaborative effort, and it was in response to one of the Taipei Biennale.
I did a project in 2008 at the Taipei Biennial, in which I was interested in the condition and the power of art spaces. Out of that, I created an art center. But maybe I came up with a better example for your question. And since we're in Vienna in this local context here, I'm also the co-founder of a restaurant called Ramen in Vienna. It was founded in 2002. The point of me mentioning this is that since I grew up in Austria, until 2002, not only with ramen, but many other restaurants, I was looked at, or the Chinese community was looked at with all the stereotypes and prejudice of not being able to spell the word with R and all these things. And every Chinese was looked as somebody working in a Chinese restaurant with a very stereotypical aesthetic of dragons, and number 11 is the spring roll, 23 is chicken with something, with all these things. And we broke with these sort of stereotypes. And the ramen became a restaurant, not as a Chinese stereotypical restaurant where people could not spell certain words, but it became a space where just a few young people wanted to open a restaurant. And it felt to me this was, for me, a more bigger cultural contribution to a city or a place or an area. And maybe, if I may just finish that, I didn't, of course, witness the change of China directly, but I witnessed something completely different, which is the perception of Chinese and China. As I grew up here, in the 70s and 80s, people would poke you in the face on the street at best. And people would call you by names I should not say tonight, but they would use very, nasty names and all these things. But now China is very chic. It's in the whole magazine. You go to the Louis Vuitton shop, there is somebody working, speaking Chinese. I think 20 years ago, if I had gone to the Louis Vuitton, I would have been kicked out big time. And now they happily see our credit cards, and yours certainly as well. So it's a different perception to that. And one thing, even though now we're on the sunny side of this, beach, we should not forget that the new people who are being kicked out of the Louis Vuitton shop are those who, as I always said, are arriving now in the last few years. These are the new people that are being kicked out. These are the people being called with words we cannot want to be called ourselves. And it'll change in 20 years. I believe in human progress that it'll change, and then it's a different game. And I hope we'll have something learned from this sort of change of perceptions that we need to embrace as well.
Weiwei, as you mentioned, and I was describing that you were involved in curating, publishing, blogging, multitask, but really with a very strong commitment to supporting and encouraging diverse artistic thinking in the Chinese art community. And I remember you once described yourself as a plumber in the local art system, trying to fix all kinds of problems. But at the same time, I felt that this kind of commitment, this deep commitment, and these contributions have also brought you a great sense of frustrations with the local art community and your colleagues in China, in the way that there is almost no recognition of that contribution. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, it always gave me a very difficult task to talk about. It's not necessarily I want to talk about. The fact is, well, I think I appreciate you recognize the reality. I used to have some kind of naiveness. I think, okay, that's the best time when government doesn't even know what is contemporary art. Contemporary art has been thinking or portrayed as a Western conspiracy, trying to subversive the communist society. So you think when the connection are so cut it off, so I think that's the best time, because you really don't want to be recognized. There's no way you can be recognized. So people are doing things which are more interesting, because you only do things when you think it's necessary. So I enjoyed for a while to create those kind of space and underground publication. As you said, as a plumber, to fix up whoever give me a call, I would give some advice or try to help. But until my ceiling is falling down. So it really, ironically, Chinese government has taken 2 of my studio down, one in Shanghai, one in Beijing, right in front of me or the public, very brutally, and with no explanation. And also, that is generally reflects the Chinese art society. When my name has been deleted from exhibitions, or my activity has been deleted, I have so many Chinese artist friends, or so many people. We give them the first shows, trying to help them to make catalogs, trying to help them to really crack the language of why we need conceptual art, why we can still have our own space in our heart or in between us in the conversation, in the most difficult time. But basically, there's no artist would raise the voice when I was disappeared. That makes me really wonder, I know almost all the Chinese artists in the early generation, not after I arrest, because I feel totally disillusioned. I often ask if your cat's lost, you would post a poster to say, where is that cat? But when you have an artist like me disappeared in China, almost there's no voice to say, doesn't matter what kind of crime that man has been made any kind of crime, but where is he? Why are you hiding him? There's no such response in art community. I mean, you see this writing on Tate, Free Ai Weiwei, or many museums, or in Guggenheim, there's over 40,000 people writing or sign the names, but not in China. In Hong Kong, you see people put on subways, sidewalk, project on the military buildings from PRC, China Liberation Army. It's so impressive, but I don't even know it because I was in secret detention. So that is basically we are living in 2 parallel worlds, China and the rest of the world. And, so it's very hard to have this kind of meeting and discussions because we really have to prepare the very profound knowledge to understand what is the difference.
It's a very poignant note, but with that, I know that I promised we will open the discussion to the floor. I realize that we are running out of time, but I wonder if we can still take 1 or 2 questions. Yeah, that's all right. So is there any questions? I see.
Good evening. My question is to Ai Weiwei. So just like you, I was living in New York and not very happy. Then I moved to Berlin. I became happier. Then I moved to Vienna last 4 years ago. I became very, very happy. So maybe you should consider the same, and maybe you can find a better studio than a basement. So, just a little tip. So I'm a big fan of yours, and I was just wondering you're very critical of China, the regime, we all know this. What critiques do you have for Europe? Because you've been living here for the last 3 years, so I'll be curious to learn more.
Well, after 2015, July, I moved to Berlin. And after that, I traveled to over 150 destinations, visited 20, maybe almost 30 nations, and 40 refugee camps in Middle East or in Africa, in Bangladesh, Mexico, many unimaginable places, Gaza, and Israel. So for me, it's a learning experience because I raised up in China under Chairman Mao's education. He always teach me to say you have to really have the vision of the world. But of course, you know, that time nobody even have a passport. How could you have a vision of the world? So since I can travel, when Chinese government gave me back to my passport, I traveled a lot of places. And I made over 400 interviews, mainly talk about my understanding about Europe and the world, you know, refugee crisis, what that means, and how. Well, it will be a long talk then. So I would say, if you ask my simple impression about Europe, I think Europe had a long time of enjoy since end of World War II, and also celebrated after so-called globalization. I think it comes to a critical point. It's a very challenging moment. I think the crisis of Europe is still like trying to find its own identity in this kind of time, because so much challenge from every aspect. You know, the basic values Europe hold, like humanity or human rights, freedom of speech, all has been challenged. So if you see very small signal like this U.S. Washington Post journalist being murdered in Turkey's, you know, in the consular embassy of the Saudi. And then you see how the Europe would respond to a situation like that. Basically, I think there's not much response. So if Europe can accept a situation like that, then what kind of Europe we're talking about? And of course, it's a small manner. You know, if you talk about refugees, the European has been dealing with, it's about 2 million refugees in Europe. But if you think Turkey already holds over 3 million refugees, 90% of refugees are really being hosted by the world, how do you say, economy under 2% of this world, you know, how do you call that part? The net of the growth of the whole world. It's only 90% are holding by like Jordan or Lebanon and Turkey and other nations. But only like less than 5% held by Europe, already caused the whole Europe the rightist movement. And the people cannot accept those people. So what kind of Europe we're talking about? It's not a nations trying not to take any kind of responsibility, or trying to just push those human crises, or to sacrifice its very essential value, and trying to, I mean, still have the dream of Europe. I think that is the end of it. And Europe will face a much critical moment in the next decade. If, you know, people still take this kind of fake illusion, we have a freedom or we have this kind of democracy, I think if we don't challenge those ideas, then this is very critical.
Thank you.
One more question.
Yeah, I have a question to Weiwei. Thank you for being here with us. It's a personal question about the internet as a tool of freedom of expression. But on the other hand, it's becoming more and more a tool of controlling us. So I was just wondering how you're dealing with this, like with the cell phone controls and knows every movement of us. Do you mind about that, or do you take any measures, or do you advise something?
Well, I used to say, if you're poor people, you don't need privacy. and you don't have privacy. I always tell Chinese authority, I don't have a secret. You have a lot of a secret. So when they set up 25 civilians around my studio, I said, hey, this is very funny. You know, I would set up civilians right above my bed. So I broadcasting my activities 24 hours a day until Chinese authorities say, you have to shut it off because million people are watching how I sleep. And also I like to sleep without clothes. And so they cannot accept it. So I think it's all how you use the internet. Of course, China developed, the high technology for facial identification and trying to, maintain this so-called stability, spend billions on those. So Chinese internal stability, stability, not stupidity. And the cost is higher than their education. Can you believe that? And higher than their military spending. So you see how dictatorship are so worried about individuals, movement. Actually, China is the most peaceful nation. People are not really going to have any kind of, it's not dangerous society. It's not like, it's almost no religion still alive. It's no NGO, no any kind of neighbors or, it's basically, it's like a sand. You cannot really race against a party which have over 80 million people. And, besides that, you have a military basically controlled by the government and the police. They all working, the whole judicial system working for the party. So there's no single law practice not under the Communist Party's interpretation, under their will. So even with that kind of society, the government are so scared. They're scared to death. I think they must lose their life and sleep every night. So why? What they are trying to? I know, they make so much money, but nobody trusts that society. Their children all move out. They all study in the West, and they all buy properties in China because simply that society have never really built a trust. Why? Because the government is not legitimate. They never let anybody vote. After 70 years, establish this nation. They don't trust their own people. So, of course, internet, I think, is still the best, and because we can communicate. I can immediately post, and that would be impossible in the past. Yeah.
Well, I think we have run out of time. I would like to invite all of you to join me in thanking all the panelists for their wonderful contributions tonight.